In this video, I'm creating an oil painting of a scene with some windswept clouds and a little barn or church with a small road going off into the distance. So what you see at the very beginning is blocking in the basic composition to get the major dark areas established and figure out if the composition is working and does it make sense with the curves and the shape, as well as the darkest darks and then some of the lighter light areas. I'm intentionally keeping the sky empty because the cloud work that I'll put in can all be done in grays and whites, so these dark earth tones aren't necessary. The earth tones that I used to establish the foundation of the painting, I started with burnt umber and later realized I could have done that with some ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I wasn't sure if I was going to use the burnt sienna, so I just started with raw umber and made changes as the painting evolved. So here what you're seeing is jumping in and establishing major shapes up in the clouds. I started with that purple tone because of course purple is important in contrast to the yellow that's on the lit side, but also that was my way of blocking in the darkest darks in the sky. And you'll notice that I made sure that I had the major sky areas created before moving down into the land space. And there's a reason for that. When creating a painting of an outdoor space or a landscape, it's important to remember that even though it's huge, the areas that you're looking at respond in the same way that an interior still life do. Everything, light on everything is bouncing off of everything else. And the sky, in a way, is a major object. It is a space, but the clouds are large. They're bouncing light, and the color of light that they're bouncing into the space really makes a big difference in everything below. In addition to that, there's a lot of water in the air. In this case, the clouds create that feeling of a lot of atmosphere, and there's water and mist and maybe some morning fog rising up that's creating atmosphere along the ground. So in terms of the order of the paints, my basic palette was burnt umber to start for the ground or the compositional sketch. And then I added ultramarine, quinacridone magenta, cadmium yellow, and then eventually you'll see some burnt umber added in. One of the things that painters often do, and I love to do this myself, is we use a limited when we're working on a landscape painting. And that's particularly useful when creating atmosphere. One reason is that forces you to naturally work in the subtle shifts of color within grays, rather than amping up the color in a really strong way. But you do still have strong colors if you need to create something that has a lot of impact. So here now again you see that once the yellow was established, I then added the quinacridone magenta and yellow together to create a very soft and subtle orange. It doesn't create as bright of an orange as a cadmium orange, and that created a natural transition within the clouds as it works its way back towards the purple. It's easier using that quinacridone magenta and yellow to shift into the purple tones, and then later you'll see me add ultramarine blue and white in those areas where I want to add a lot of blue, as you can see on the right-hand side of the clouds. Now, the right-hand side of the clouds in the video may look, and even in real life, looking at the painting, look a little bit turquoise, but that is only because it's in contrast to the oranges and the other warm tones that are on the front side of the clouds. So here what you see down below, I'm starting to add those darkest darks with ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta, and then I'm also exploring the level of green that I want in the foreground. In reality, these greens were like very bright and beautiful, but there's a lot of moisture out in that distant area along the road that's softening those yellows and oranges. So I need to work with the paints that I have and kind of calibrate that to make sense of it. So in order to do that, I constantly have to come back to the value range within the drawing. Now here you see that I've jumped in and added more blue in the water that's reflecting. There's some moisture on the grass in the road that's sunk down into the ditch areas. So I'm adding some of that because that is a reflection of the sky. Once I've added these greens in that field area off to the right and in the bushes that are growing along the fence that will appear in a few minutes, you'll see that I'll have to make some decisions about how much of that to keep in the bright green that I'm creating and how much of that to either soften with orange or white or pink or something to sort of knock down the intensity but still keep the beauty of that color in the distance. So I'm revisiting those darkest darks and even asking myself, how much chroma do I want in those darkest darks? If we put too much chroma in those darkest darks, it can draw the viewer's attention away from other things. So there's a balance to be met there. So I'm exploring now those pinks in the distance. Pink and orange, red, those colors tend to have a lower strength back in the distance because the water particles in the air disrupt that wavelength of light from reaching us if we're standing in the foreground. So I find those colors really lovely where the light is hitting the atmosphere and also sitting in the scene, but I need to make sure that they're not too intense. So that's where white helps a lot to put in those pinks but then bring them down a bit. Here you can see that I'm exploring the intensity of the color and the value shifts and temperature shifts between the shade side of the building and the lit side. In a few minutes, you'll see that I even add some atmosphere on top of the roof, and then you'll start to notice that I'm adding lots of yellow and light coming from the left-hand side from the sun that's falling on the edges of the trees and the tops of the grass back in the distance. So I start to move back and forth and think about how much of that yellow really can make it to the eye in the foreground, but I also want it to create that brightness of light in the background. I'd love to share more of this with you. If you're interested in taking some of my online classes or private lessons, please just contact me directly using the contact information on that website you see below, triciaratliff.com. I have some upcoming online classes and also do one-on-one training and mentoring to help artists achieve higher level of skill, but most importantly, your vision for where you want your art to be. So coming back to this painting in particular, notice that I've switched now to this really tiny brush. So as a general rule, I try to start with the biggest brush I can handle for the job. And then naturally, I'll find that there are things that I cannot do with that larger brush. And as the painting progresses, I'll switch to a smaller brush, so more of a medium. And then finally, at the very end, there are some nice flourishes and a few areas that really can't be accomplished with the brushes I've worked with. And that's when I switch to the smallest brush. As a rule of thumb, I tell myself I only have a few minutes with these smaller brushes. And that helps me avoid making a looser painting too fussy. Now, there are other times where I may use a little brush for long periods of time because the painting maybe is about all of those little details or flourishes. But in this case, I wanted to make sure that there's just enough of that interest and just a few brush strokes to make it interesting and move the eye around the canvas, but that we don't lose the overall purpose of the painting, which is that strong contrast between this large, beautiful sky that's pressing that moisture down into this atmospheric space where we have that gorgeous green field coming in from the distance, and all of that is now reflecting onto this lovely building off to the right. So, did I do the scene justice? Well, I guess that's for the viewer to decide, but each day as an artist, we just do our very best to bring to light and bring into other people's lives the beauty that we see in the world. As I wrap up the painting here, you'll see a few more changes in these details. Notice here I'm exploring. Sometimes it looks like as painters that we know everything that we're doing in advance, and in some ways we do have to plan, obviously, where we're headed and have a clear sense of that. But then as we get closer to the end, we have to ask ourselves questions like, is this working? So notice those bushes way in the background there. I added that yellow paint, and I'm adding some more white mist into the sky and even some yellow tones of light around the edges of foliage and even along the top edge of the building there, because I felt that that would really create that look of light that I was going for, connecting the background to the foreground and the sky to the land. So the reason that happened at the end is that, transparently, I'll just share that I stepped back from the painting for a moment and I looked at it and I thought, it doesn't have that special something I was looking for. But I was able to put it in right at the end. Enjoy your painting.